Crown of Sorrow is the new raid in Season 7, and today I'm going to explain each encounter and give advice on the easiest ways to beat them. I wish I could have gotten this out sooner, but a few things ended up pushing this back, and well, for my first raid guide, I felt like taking the extra time to really nail this down wasn't a terrible thing. For Crown of Sorrow, I would recommend being 725 power, 720 at the very minimum, and if you can make it to 730 or higher, you'll likely have very few problems surviving. There are a total of 4 encounters in Crown of Sorrow, 3 major encounters and a minor one. Each of them share the common theme of buffed and unbuffed players working together. Understanding how this buff should be handled is key to beating every encounter, so let's go over how it works. The buff you'll be working with is called Witch's Blessing, and it allows you to kill certain enemies that people without the buff cannot kill. The Witch's Blessing buff lasts for 1 minute, and after that 1 minute ends, the blessing turns into Witch's Curse, which will kill you after a few seconds. Obviously, you want to avoid that, so to do so, you'll be utilizing a purple sphere called the Witch's Vessel. The vessel will be part of every encounter, just like the buff will, and to use it, you'll need a minimum of 1 blessed and 1 non-blessed player, both standing in the purple circle around it and shooting the sphere at the same time. This is like flipping a switch, and will remove the buff from any blessed player within the circle, while granting a buff to any player inside the circle who doesn't have one. Blessed players want to keep a close eye on their buff timer and make sure to communicate when they need their buff removed. In the first encounter though, all players should be going to this vessel at the same time and essentially switching their buff to the unbuffed teammates. The entire raid revolves around having players buffed or blessed while others are not, in order to destroy things like crystals, which we'll get to in a moment. For the first encounter, you'll want to bring short to mid-range weapons. This is by far the most flexible major encounter in the raid, so you could use almost anything here. Hand cannons, shotguns, fusion rifles, light machine guns, all good options. For subclasses, mostly solar and void supers are good here, but as you level up, more options become available. Well of Radiance and Tether are godly and really helpful for lower power teams, while Sunbreaker, Blade Barrage, and Golden Gun, as well as Nova Bomb 2, are good choices to control ads and kill ogres. The first thing you want to do in this encounter is separate your group into 3 teams of 2. 2 players are going to cover the left side of the room, 2 in the middle, and 2 on the right side. Choose 3 players, 1 from each team, to receive the blessing buff by standing in the green pool directly in front of the rally flag. The other 3 non-blessed players should start on their sides of the room. While you have the Witch's Blessing buff, there are certain types of enemies you can't kill, and the same goes for when you don't have the buff. All players must work together to clear enemies that they can kill. So you've got 3 players who are standing in the green pool to get their buff, and then they'll go help their unbuffed teammates kill enemies on their side. There's going to be 2 groups of knights that spawn, and then shortly after a crystal will appear. To destroy these crystals, you'll need 1 blessed and 1 non-blessed player shooting the crystal at roughly the same time. Whoever is blessed can shoot the crystal first to prime it, and then the non-blessed player can shoot it immediately after. But for crystals, you don't really need to worry about this timing, just make sure you're both shooting it together. There will be 1 crystal nearby each team, 1 on the left, 1 in the middle, and 1 on the right. They have a few different spawns, but they're always going to be in that general area of your side. Since each team of 2 has 1 blessed and 1 non-blessed player, you should coordinate with your teammate as soon as you see or hear the crystal spawn. Call out where it is so that your teammate can find it and help you destroy it. After destroying this crystal, the Witch's Blessing buff timer will probably be close to running out. At this point, you want to have every player migrate to the Witch's Vessel in the middle of the room. This is where you have everyone stand inside the circle and shoot the vessel to switch the buffs. If you clear the enemies fast enough, feel free to switch the buffs before the crystals spawn in. You'll get a better feel of the timing when you run this a few times. After the first crystal is destroyed, a few more knights will spawn, and then it's time for 2 ogres. 1 ogre will be blessed, and the other won't. So make sure to split up into 2 teams, so that the 3 blessed players can kill their ogre, and the non-3 blessed can kill theirs. Shortly after this happens, another 3 crystals are going to spawn. Destroying them will complete 1 cycle of this encounter, and in total you need to finish 4 cycles. Make sure to head back to the Witch's Vessel and switch buffs after destroying the last set of crystals in a round, as you'll have some time before any new enemies spawn. If you use the vessel immediately after destroying the last set of crystals, the vessel should reappear before the next wave of enemies, giving your team an opportunity to switch the buffs again. It's important to be constantly aware of your blessing timer and make sure to communicate when it's getting low. Unless crystals are spawned or are about to spawn, you want to make sure you meet up at the Witch's Vessel and switch buffs so that no one dies a horrible cursed death. A few rounds of this encounter and you'll begin to get the timing down for when you should meet up and switch buffs. But that's basically how the first encounter works. Staying alive and clearing your ads are very crucial parts of this fight and the entire raid, so do your part and kill your enemies. Now, what I'm about to say is some extra information that you don't really need to worry about too much, but it can come in handy. In the event that a player with a buff dies, that means they will lose their buff. If this happens, everyone should immediately return to the Witch's Vessel, assuming there's no crystals up, and everyone should stand in the circle and switch buffs, except for the person who died. The person who died and lost their buff should stand away from the rest of the team, making sure they're outside of the circle. This will give the buff to their teammate, but not to the person who died, basically balancing out the teams again so everyone has one blessed and one non-blessed player. If you can stay alive, you won't have to deal with that, but it's just some advice in case it happens. The second encounter is extremely simple and there are no enemies here. The only weapon recommendations I'm going to make are weapons that can fire mid to long range. Things like a light machine gun, scout rifle, auto rifle, pulse rifle, etc. Like before, you'll begin the encounter by designating 3 players to be the blessed by standing in the green pool. It's easier just to have the same 3 people be blessed for the entire raid, but it's up to you. Receiving the buff will also spawn in crystals. Once again, to destroy these, 1 blessed and 1 non-blessed player must shoot them at the same time. Crystals will spawn freely in the air and around the room, even above you, so keep your eyes peeled. Crystals will also spawn on platforms that you need to jump to, and these platform crystals have shields around them that you need to walk inside of to destroy. The easiest method that we found here is to have one team of 2 always go to the rightmost crystal, and one team of 2 always go to the leftmost crystal, with the remaining team staying close behind in case someone falls. If the right or left team does die, you can just send one player from the team that's just chilling behind to go fill in. Designating a team per crystal definitely removes the confusion and chaos of who's going to get which crystal. Eventually, you'll get to a Witch's Vessel, and everyone should get inside and exchange buffs at the same time. For the majority of this, there will be 2 crystals with shields, but it will eventually be reduced to 1 shielded crystal, so be careful if everyone tries to jump at once. If enough players make it to a Witch's Vessel and switch buffs, it'll actually give you a checkpoint at that vessel. Destroy all crystals, get to the end of the chasm, and that's encounter 2. Encounter 3 is where things start to get a little hectic, so let's break this down and make it a lot easier. You want short to mid-range weapons to deal with enemies up close. Things like rapid-fire shotguns with trench barrel and things like loaded question hit really hard. Mountaintop is also a good option, with grenade launchers being a really smart pick here. The best options for heavy weapons include Wendigo GL3, the Vanguard Pinnacle weapon, which I would highly recommend you get this thing as soon as possible. Prospector, the exotic grenade launcher. Any aggressive frame grenade launcher with spike grenades and extremely high velocity. Sleeper Simulant, light machine guns, and swords. The last one might seem like a joke, but it was actually one of the things our team used for our first clears. We'll talk more about that damage phase later though. There are 3 sides to this giant room, and again, everyone should split up into 3 teams of 2, with each team taking a separate zone. Top zone will be Team 1, right zone will be Team 2, and left zone will be Team 3. In this encounter, there are 3 Gahlran Deceptions, 1 per zone. Melee one of them to begin the encounter. Green walls are going to appear, blocking each team from moving out of their zone. Once this happens, each team will face one of 3 different scenarios. One team will have to babysit the Deception boss, staying away from him as not to get sliced by his cleavers. If you don't have the boss though, the second scenario is you might have a green buff pool. If you have this, one person on your team should grab the buff and kill the blessed thrall, while the other player kills the wizards. The third scenario is just a normal zone, where you have no buffs and no boss, and you can kill everything as normal. Each team is going to get one of these 3 different scenarios, and during this encounter, 2 wizards and some acolytes will spawn for each zone, one at a time. Killing them spawns an ogre, which should also be killed very quickly. If all 3 ogres are dead, a Witch's Vessel will spawn, allowing the team who picked up the buff at the beginning to transfer to the next team. Next meaning clockwise, or in sequential order. So if Team 1 starts with the buff, they pass to Team 2. If Team 2 starts with the buff, they pass to Team 3. And if Team 3 starts with the buff, they pass it to Team 1. To quote-unquote pass the buff, you should have both players from the team that started with the buff stand in the witch's vessel circle, while only one player from the next team receives the buff. The reason 2 players should always pass to just one is so that each team only has one blessed player on their side. The 2 players on the same side will switch their buffs, while the third wheel from the other team will get a buff. 2 players always pass to one player, remember that. When a witch's vessel is used, this will cause the barrier between zones to dissolve, but you do not need to leave your zone until later. So you've killed all of your ogres and passed the buff to the next team. From here, just repeat what you just did, killing both wizards and the ogre that spawns. The team who's babysitting the boss will be the last team to receive a buff, and when they're ready, one player should distract the boss, while the other meets every other player from all teams at the vessel. If you are able to kill all of your enemies fast enough, every player will have enough time to make it to this vessel before they are killed by their buff expiring. Once all players are here, the player babysitting the boss can join in the circle and everyone should shoot the vessel. This will result in 4 players being blessed and 2 players being non-blessed. At this point, the final wall will come down and the boss will begin his wipe mechanic shortly. This means he'll stand still and start glowing green, and you should avoid getting hit by him until this happens. In order to break the boss's immune shield, 1 blessed player and 1 non-blessed player have to melee the boss, with the blessed player being the first to melee, and the non-blessed player meleeing immediately after. Doing so makes him vulnerable to damage. Something very important to note is that if you are not going in for the melee and you have a Witch's Blessing buff, stay away from the boss because you can actually lose your buff by being too close. While you have Witch's Blessing, you cannot damage the boss, so don't waste your ammo. Just sit back and kill any thrall that might get in the way. After you break the boss's shield, you'll have a short period of time to damage him before he returns immune. As soon as his shield returns, send the next blessed person in to melee with another non-blessed person. To make it easier to set up, you can have the same non-blessed person melee every single time. The second blessed person runs in with a non-blessed, and this again will break his shield, allowing for a second damage period. Assuming no one dies or gets their buff removed prematurely, you'll have a total of 4 shield breaks, which means 4 opportunities to damage in one cycle. When you run out of blessed players and the boss's shield returns, players should quickly scatter, collect any orbs or ammo, and then run back to their sides. Melee the Deception to begin the second cycle. If you can execute this, you'll have a total of 3 phases to kill the boss, but you should shoot for 2, as the less cycles you have to run, the better. As for really strong DPS options, some of the best include the previously mentioned Wendigo, Prospector, and an aggressive frame grenade launcher. Prospector and Wendigo are among the highest DPS weapons in the entire game right now, but surprisingly, they can both be beaten by a god-rolled aggressive frame grenade launcher with spike grenades and very high velocity. It can even beat Wendigo with 6 enhanced grenades. The easiest one to get your hands on is the outrageous Fortune grenade launcher, as it's been consistently dropping for me from Vanguard Strike and Nightfall milestones. Mountaintop can also put out some pretty insane damage for a non-heavy grenade launcher. But one of my favorite ways to clear this encounter, and one that my team has found a lot of success with, is using swords. With Season of Opulence, swords got a huge buff. They saw their max ammo capacity increase to 70, and if you can get a sword rolled with some decent perks, maybe even Whirlwind Blade, and you add a boss spec mod onto it, it becomes an extremely deadly weapon against this boss. Not only can you take out ogres quickly with it, but since the sword counts as a melee, you can also use this to break the boss's shield. Perform 2 light attacks and then 1 heavy attack to maximize your damage once he's vulnerable. Swords can deal a lot more damage than I was expecting, with some players on my team hitting close to 3 million damage in just one phase with it. Just be careful not to push the boss outside of the walls, because this can happen and you could miss out on damage. Attack the boss so that he gets stuck up against a box or push towards the center of the room. If you've been struggling with getting a lot of damage, try out swords. If you're still not able to get a lot of damage output thanks to low power players, try stacking more buffs. If you're already using strong weapons, then adding on buffs like Tractor Cannon or Melting Point and Empowering Melee will significantly increase your damage. One thing I want to mention that may change in the future is that old Leviathan armor perks actually do currently work in the raid. So if you played during year 1 and earned any of the old Leviathan armor sets, you can pull them out of your collections and they come with a randomly rolled Leviathan mod. Sadly, they don't come with random rolls, not yet anyway, which is why I would recommend only leveling up the gauntlets and the class item. The class item can roll with a mod that buffs your ability damage by 25%, and this includes your super. The gauntlets can roll with a mod called Striking Hand, where melee kills buff all damage by 20%. If you find yourself struggling with damage, take advantage of this now, because this may or may not get patched. So try those class item mods out and throw in a few supers like Blade Barrage, Golden Gun, and Nova Bomb if you have to. Honestly, the whole sword strategy is very fun to me. It's cool to have swords be a relevant option against a raid boss again, and I would certainly recommend trying it out. The fourth and final encounter combines everything we've learned throughout the raid, and all mechanics are coming into play here, as well as some new ones. The hardest thing about this final encounter is remembering everything and executing it all without dying, since every single death can throw everyone off. Most of the weapons from the last encounter are viable and even recommended, minus the swords. If you're looking for a safe, guaranteed 2-phase, Outbreak Perfected is, dare I say, perfect for this boss. More options open up as you level up, and there is one specific method I want to cover which includes Anarchy, and we'll talk about that when we get to the damage phase portion of the video. When you begin the encounter, the green buff pool will spawn where the rally flag is. Just like in the first 2 encounters, 3 players should stand in the pool and receive the Witch's Blessing buff here. Then split up into your same teams so that every team has 1 blessed and 1 non-blessed player, and here you have a few objectives. Blessed and non-blessed players are responsible for killing their respective enemies. Blessed players, for example, should be killing the knights. All players should avoid getting hit by the boss's fireball attacks, which to do this you can simply stand up against the wall closest to Gahlran, and all of his fireball attacks will actually go right over your head. And all blessed players should keep track of and switch the buff with their teammate before the timer runs out. We'll talk about some of those things more in depth in just a minute. One huge component of this fight is within 10 seconds of starting this encounter, a crystal is going to spawn in one team's zone. You need a blessed and non-blessed player shooting at the crystal at the same time to destroy it. The crystals are the most important thing to keep track of here, because if it explodes, it wipes everyone. Keeping track of your buff timer is equally important, but luckily this time around you and your partner can switch buffs at any time you feel comfortable. My partner and I found it easiest to switch the buff after killing the second knight that spawns in, so we'd run to the vessel to our right and switch there. During this entire encounter, the crystal will be rotating around the room clockwise, so if it starts at team 1, it's going to team 2 next, and then 3, and then back to 1. The most helpful callout you can make in this entire encounter is telling the next team that they are about to receive the crystal. If you're team 2 and you just killed your crystal, say, team 3, crystal is coming to you. With so much going on in this encounter, it can be near impossible to keep track of everything, including the crystal. So letting the next team know when they're up next is paramount. 3 knights and some acolytes will spawn in the exact same spot in every zone, every time. And after the 3rd knight, Cursed Thrall and an Ogre will spawn in for 2 out of the 3 teams. One lucky team will get the Deception to spawn, along with some Cursed Thrall. That team should have their blessed player kill all Cursed Thrall in their zone, and then with their non-blessed player, coordinate a shield break on the Deception when he is standing in the middle of the room. You want him closer to Gahlran if possible, and no farther away than at the top of the stairs. If you get him in a good position, or at least close, both the blessed and non-blessed players will melee the Deception, breaking his shield and stunning him like you did in the last encounter. An easy way to accomplish this without dying is by placing a Ward of Dawn bubble down. If you've got a Titan on your team and they equip Helm of Saint 14, the bubble's going to disorient the Deception, and with your overshield, you can easily cause a shield break. If you're not a Titan or a Warlock who can use their Well of Radiance, my advice is to stand atop the pillars in your room and have the blessed person go in for the melee with a non-blessed player following up quickly behind them. Ward of Dawn is by far the easiest way to accomplish this shield break, and honestly, it's nice to see Bubble getting some use again. Once you've broken the Deception's shield and he's stunned, you then want to look up at Gahlran in front of you. His left hand will be doing an attack, and it's going to glow green a few seconds after this attack ends. You and your teammate should shoot the hand as it's glowing green to cause the boss to bring down a giant cleaver on the Deception below, killing it. The hand doesn't need much damage, a few bullets from one player can actually take it out pretty easily. Just make sure you're not in the vicinity of this cleaver when it comes crashing down, or it can kill you. Unless you want to be a badass and chill inside the bubble, that works too. As soon as you stun him from the shield break, your blessed player will lose their buff. This will be really bad if a crystal is coming to your team next. So if you know you're up next for crystal, don't stun the boss and instead wait for the crystal to spawn in your zone and destroy it first. Once you've done so, then you can stun the deception. After stunning him and bringing down the cleaver, since neither player on your team has a buff, this means one of you has to get it back. So send one player from your team to a vessel to meet up with another team. Our team used the vessel to our left, but to keep it simple, you can just send your one player to the same vessel you would normally switch the buff at, aka the one to your right. It's best to designate who will be the one player getting the buff every time, so there's no confusion. So that one person you're sending to get a buff should call out, for example, Team 2 needs a buff from Team 3. You should announce this on your way over so that you can meet with both players from the next team. And just like in the last encounter, this will give the one player without a buff, and it's going to switch the buff for the two players on the other team. Then you can return to normal and continue killing more enemies. Just remember to not forget about the crystal, and keep calling out where it's headed. Every single team is going to have to stun and kill one deception during this encounter. And once that last one dies, every Gahlran boss on all sides will begin raising his hands. They will start glowing green, and each team member should be shooting one hand to stun him. Shoot his hands, and then when the green glow disappears, shoot his head. This will cause two of the Gahlran bosses to disappear, with the only one remaining being the one boss you actually need to damage for real. When you spot the only boss remaining, call it out and then head to the vessel that is either on the left or the right of the zone where the boss is. This is up to you, but my team always chose the vessel on the right of the boss. Whatever you pick, be consistent so that no one gets confused as to where to go. One annoying thing that's going to happen is, depending on the timing here, a final crystal could spawn around this time. If you've been calling out after killing your crystal, the team that is going to receive it next should be the ones to deal with it when it spawns in. So if Team 2 kills their crystal and calls out Team 3, crystal's coming to you, and then damage phase is about to begin, Team 3 knows they are next up for crystal, and must destroy it before joining up with the rest of the team. Once the last crystal is destroyed, everyone should stand in the vessel circle and switch the buff. At this point, turn around and face the boss, as you'll be beginning the DPS phase from here. Shoot both of his glowing hands to stop his animation, and then shoot him in the head to do damage. He'll lift his hands up 2 more times after the initial animation, and you'll have to stop him from doing it every time. If 3 players are assigned to one hand each, you'll be able to shoot down his hands very quickly, and the quicker you shoot his hands, the more time you have to damage him. For damage, Outbreak Perfected is easily the safest option here, because it's accessible to everyone, and with 6 players using it, you can ensure there will be no shortage of damage. One thing our team does is shoot 6 enhanced grenades from Wendigo when the damage phase begins, and then switch to Outbreak Perfected. Another solid strategy is one that includes Anarchy. If you have one player in the fire team using Anarchy, and they attach 3 grenades to the boss's chest, it will not only give an insane boost to damage, but if shot directly in the middle of his chest, the Anarchy can actually stun his hands for you, allowing you an almost perfect damage phase with very few pauses. You'll want the Anarchy player to reapply these grenades again once or twice throughout the damage phase as well. Well of Radiance with Lunafaction boots will seriously boost your potential damage, and since you don't really want to use Tractor Cannon here, a Code of the Commander Titan with their Banner Shield will also be of great help boosting your damage. Players with the Witch's Blessing buff here should try and throw down a grenade or 2 and prevent the Thrall from getting in people's way. If your Banner Shield Titan has a Witch's Blessing buff, then their shield is just going to kill all the Thrall anyway. Golden Gun is also really good for this, of course, especially combined with the old Leviathan class armor, boosting your super damage by 25%. As soon as this damage phase ends completely, everyone should turn around, stand back in the vessel circle, and switch their buff once again before returning to their sides. If you have any issues with not being able to shoot the boss hands from your current location, you can choose a different DPS spot with a better line of sight to his hands. Just be mindful that you'll have to travel farther to switch the buff after the damage phase ends. You'll need to repeat the cycle of this encounter to get to the next damage phase if you weren't able to kill him in the first one. You have a total of 3 damage phases, similar to last encounter, but you'll want to minimize the amount that you have to go through these cycles since there are so many places where people can slip up. I would highly advise completing this in 2 phases if possible. If every team executes their job correctly and stays alive, congratulations, you've beaten the Crown of Sorrow raid. Overall, it's a very short raid, but one that requires a lot of multitasking, communication, and staying alive at all costs. Please let me know how I did, as this is my first raid guide ever, and it was a pretty daunting task, so any feedback would be greatly appreciated. If you would like to see more guides like this in the future, let me know down below, and thank you all very much for watching.